Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video. I've got a nice quick one for you today. Sorry for the lack of uploads in the last couple of weeks. If you do follow me on stream, then you will know that me and my girlfriend, we've been trying to buy a house, which has been a little bit tricky this year. We've actually been trying since January basically to get a house, but we've had 2 houses fall through and we're now on to house number 3. So things have stepped up for house number 3. So I hope to have some good news soon about that, but we are not having a great time of it, but in the grand scheme of things, it's quite a minor inconvenience to the rest of the world right now. So, you know, I still consider ourselves very lucky in that respect. But apologies for the lack of uploads because of this. So this is going to be a nice, short, sweet video, something a little bit simpler than the guides and things I've done before. So this is just going to be about 5 rules for Gloomhaven that you might not know, or perhaps maybe you've been playing wrong. So a nice short video for you today, guys. Hopefully you might find some of this information useful. So every tip in this video is going to be applicable to both the tabletop version of Gloomhaven and Gloomhaven Digital. I am going to start moving my content towards focusing a little bit more on Gloomhaven Digital, because I feel like that's sort of the new kid on the block, and that's what a lot of people are going to start playing soon and want to start playing, and perhaps that's going to be your first introduction to Gloomhaven now, and I think that's going to be the case for a lot of people with the lower price point and the ease of kind of accessibility of getting into the game. And while Gloomhaven Digital does a fantastic job of implementing the board game, it does sort of automate a lot of the rules for you. So there are going to be some things that perhaps you don't understand or you've never seen before because, hey, you've never had to pick up the rule book yourself, read it, and actually play it out on the tabletop yourself. So some of these rules are going to be based a little bit around that, but again, I will always try and make my content to work for both versions of the game. So if you have any interest in that content, please do subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more, and of course hit that like button if you do enjoy the video. If there is anything that I've missed out here that you'd like to see me talk about, then please put it in the comments below. And of course, if you want to ask me any questions, you can always catch me live at twitch.tv/mandatoryquest. I stream Gloomhaven there every week, 3 days a week, every Monday, Wednesday and Sunday. So come hang out and say hi. Okay, so rules number 1 is refreshing item cards. So when we talk about refreshing item cards, some items that you can get in the game will have the little symbol where you can sort of turn it horizontally, exhaust that card, and then essentially you can, once you long rest, you can then turn it vertically and refresh that card so that you can then use that again throughout the rest of the scenario until you use it again, and then you long rest to bring it back again. These are different to the lost ones that you get, which have the little X on that you can only use once per scenario. So some of these cards, mainly the armor cards, actually have a number of charges on them. So every time that you use it, you use a charge, and then once all of the charges have been used, that's when the card would be turned horizontally, exhausted, and then it will be ready to be refreshed again. Now the rules difference that I see here, and I've seen some confusion, is whether or not if you long rest and you still have charges left on this item, can you then refresh the charges, or can you artificially exhaust the item so that you can get all your charges back? Well, no, you can't. So tanks out there, if you're using these items to tank, all of these armor items to tank, then you do need to make sure that you've actually used all of the charges and you've exhausted it properly before you can then refresh it and get all of your charges back. So long resting when you've only got 1 charge left on that plate armor is not particularly a great deal. Sometimes you'll be forced into it, but this is definitely a small rule that I see people get a bit confused about, and also something that in the digital version of the game, it automates all for you. So sometimes you will actually have to hover over your items to check to see how many charges are left before you commit to that long rest. Okay, so quick rule number 2 is about cards in your active areas. So pretty much all of the characters in Gloomhaven, aside from a few, will have cards. Maybe they're summons, but they're ones that go into your active area, which is essentially, if you're playing tabletop, you put them above your player board. If you are playing digital, then they just sort of like integrate within your character, and they're usually on your character icon on your UI. And also they show up at the top of your card list in a little white kind of bordered format, so you can see that they are sort of active and that they are in play, if you will. So the confusion that I've seen with some of these is some characters, the Mind Thief in particular is one from the early characters, the starting characters, in which you can actually cycle these. So some people have had some confusion as to whether or not you can discard forcibly these cards that you have in your active area. And yes, you can. You do not need to play a card in order to swap them out. So if you're playing the Mind Thief and you have an augment out, you don't need to play another augment in order for that augment to go away. You can actually just voluntarily discard that from your active area if you want into your discard pile, or if it was a lost card, it would then go into your lost pile. And there are a few reasons why you'd want to do that. So for the Mind Thief, it's usually so you can get extra cards into your discard pile for your long rest, and you can also get the additional experience point for replaying the augment, and also you can actually sort of stretch out your turns, because that's going to give you another card in your discard pile to long rest. So then you've got another, perhaps a whole other turn that you can play, because you can now sort of play 2 cards in a turn, which you couldn't do before. Another starting character who can take good use of this is actually the Spellweaver. So when you play a summon for the Spellweaver, that card goes into your active area and it just stays there. Now, when you want to use your Reviving Ether card to get back all of your lost cards, you can actually discard the summon. So you can discard that into your lost pile. So then actually you can then use Reviving Ether to get the summon card back, which means you can get the extra 2 XP from playing the summon again, or you can actually then just, start using the other side of that card if you want. So again, the Spellweaver can take really good advantage of this small rule. So just bear in mind that is a small rule, that at any time you can actually discard from that active area into your discard pile or your lost pile, whichever way it needs to go. So small rule 3, 4 and 5 are actually all to do with combat, so they're pretty similar. But rule 3, we're going to talk about how you calculate your final attack value, because this is something that Gloomhaven Digital does behind the scenes, and something you may not be aware on how this actual number is calculated in Gloomhaven. It's actually quite a simple step-by-step process that you can follow for calculating this. The first step in the process is looking at your card that you played. So you find out your base attack value from your card that you played. Let's say we're playing the Scoundrel and we're playing Flanking Strike. We have an attack value of 3, and we actually are going to use the adjacency bonus here that we have because we have an ally adjacent. So we have an attack value of 5. So step 1, find your base attack value. Step 2 is to use any active bonuses that you might have in play, any items that you wish to use, and also to count poison if the enemy is poisoned, any negative effects that are affecting the target. If you have multiple things here, you can actually use them in any way you want, and you can count them in any order that you want. Most likely the first thing you're going to do is you're going to count poison as +1. There's no reason why you would not use the poison +1 first. The next thing you're going to do is use your items or anything other that you may have. So let's say I had a minor power potion, for example, things like that. The last thing I'm going to want to do is going to use smoke bombs. So if I was invisible here, this would give me the ×2 bonus with smoke bombs. So that can be a good way of you to increase your potential damage here, is to wait until the very end and use smoke bomb is the very last thing that you use. If you're playing digital, this takes care of most of this for you. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're playing tabletop, the order that you resolve this can be sometimes quite important. The next step in the process is actually drawing your attack modifier cards. So this is where if you were to draw your ×2, you would get to multiply things again. Or if you had your +1, -1, whatever it may be. Also your advantage and disadvantage, anything that would happen there, this all happens in this step. The next step is to look for any defensive values that the enemy may have, which is going to be shield. So if they do have a shield value of 2, for example, you would then deduct that 2 from your value. After this, the next step is to just do damage. So you do your total value of damage to the target. If that value is dead, great. This is where the process stops, and essentially they will drop a coin if they were not a summoned enemy. Otherwise, if they are still alive, you move on to another small little process at the end here, which is where you're going to add any negative conditions that you may have applied to the target. So if they did survive, next you move to adding negative conditions. So this may be poison, this may be wound, this may be curse, anything like that, but only if the enemy actually managed to survive. If the enemy does have retaliate on their card and they have the ability to do retaliate damage to you, they would then do retaliate damage to you. Importantly, if you were to play any push cards, you could push them away so they don't actually get to do this retaliate damage to you as this final small little section. However, if you do not, then they will still do this damage to you. Also, if you manage to play any pull cards that actually brought potentially retaliate enemy towards you, then it's important to realize that that may have brought them into retaliate range, so just worth checking. Just quickly to add to that point, it is important to clarify that you do this calculation for every single individual figure in an attack. So if you have an AoE attack, if you have a multiple target attack, it may end up that certain enemies take less or more damage than others. You do need to do this calculation for each individual target in a attack. So that leads me actually quite nicely onto rule number 4, which is to do with the terminology entire attack action versus just your next attack. So your next attack just simply mean the next figure that you attack. So even if you have an AoE attack or a multiple target attack, that will only affect the first target, the next thing that you attack from that point. So don't make mistakes by playing this and then thinking you're going to use an AoE. This is why cards like Smoke Bomb, for example, for the Scoundrel, are very good at doing single target damage. So you want to be using those with your single target attacks. Don't use them with throwing knives and think, oh, I'm going to get some extra damage out of this. It doesn't quite work like that, unfortunately. However, entire attack action does work like that. So if you do have a card or an item that gives you an entire attack action, that will apply the benefit across absolutely every target that you choose within that attack. So if you play an AoE or a multiple target attack, you will get that benefit. This is particularly why certain items like Eagle Eye Goggles are really good on AoE style characters, because you can ensure that you do the maximum amount of damage that you could possibly do, hopefully, to the enemies. Okay, and finally, rule 5, which, I mean, I couldn't do a Gloomhaven rules video without talking about this and talking about combat, and that is rolling modifier cards and how they work when you have advantage and disadvantage. Now, this is a rule in which I have played wrong in my Gloomhaven campaign for years. It took me a long time to realize that I was actually playing it wrong, and it wasn't until I started playing Gloomhaven Digital that it brought my attention to it. Then with further research, it turns out it's actually quite a common house rule. So it feels like perhaps thematically it should work in this way, but it doesn't, and that is important to know, because if you want to play the game by the book, and if you're playing Gloomhaven Digital, you have to play by the book, you have no choice. It's important to know how these rolling modifiers work when you have advantage and when you have disadvantage. So if you don't know what rolling modifiers are, these are the cards with the little arrows on them that when you draw them, you actually draw another card, and you unlock these through unlocking your perks with your character. So how these cards usually work is that when you draw them, you would then draw an additional card afterwards, but they actually function slightly differently when you have advantage and disadvantage. So when you have advantage, you still just draw 2 cards. If the cards were rolling modifier cards, if one card was a rolling modifier, or if both cards were a rolling modifier, you add the 2 cards together. You always only draw a maximum of 2 cards. That's the important takeaway here. So if I had advantage and I drew a +1 rolling modifier, and my next card that I drew was actually a miss, I would need to plus that +1 modifier to the miss card, which unfortunately results in a miss. And this is why thematically for me, I actually ended up playing a slightly different house rule, which I'll explain in a minute. But that is essentially how that by the book will work. Now, this can actually work slightly in your favor the other way with disadvantage, because with disadvantage, you actually ignore rolling modifiers completely. So if I was to draw that +1 modifier and then I was to draw, let's say, a ×2 from my disadvantage, I would actually have to take the ×2 card. You don't plus the rolling modifier, you just ignore any rolling modifiers, and you would have to take the ×2. So it can actually help you a little bit when you have disadvantage, but it can hurt you a little bit when you have advantage. If for disadvantage you were actually to draw 2 rolling modifier cards, you would then continue to draw until you drew a card that wasn't a rolling modifier, and then that card would be your result. The house rule that I like to play is actually we create piles using the rolling modifiers. So if I was to draw a +1 modifier to begin with, I would then add another card to that until basically I stopped drawing through the rolling modifiers, and that would create pile 1, and then you would move on to pile 2 and draw again for pile 2. So you could end up with there being 3 cards in each pile, for example, and then you would pick the best one. The way this gets slightly strange though is with disadvantage, because you could, for example, have an attack that actually gives you -1, but it has a stun in it, and you may have a pile that has +0 and no stun. So which one would you take? Well, the -1 is definitely worse from attack value perspective, but the stun is actually very valuable. So how do you value that that is worse or not? So it does become a little bit trickier to use this rule alongside disadvantage, but it can be done. And I mean, a lot of these times it's very corner case stuff anyway. Ifs and buts, maybe the 1 in 100,000 times that you may draw this, it's very unlikely that you come across a situation like this. But there is a house rule to use if you like it, and who knows, perhaps you've even been playing it by this house rule like me by accident anyway. There you have it, guys. 5 very quick Gloomhaven rules. Perhaps you knew them, perhaps you didn't, perhaps you're playing house rules around these, perhaps you're not. If there's anything that you think that I missed, please chuck a comment down below, or come visit me on twitch.tv/mandatoryquest. I stream there every Monday, Wednesday and Sunday. So if you've got any ideas, I try and respond to all comments down below. But if you want to ask me anything live, then you can always catch me there. If you are a Gloomhaven digital player, I do think that some of these rules are quite nice to give you a little bit more insight. If you haven't played tabletop Gloomhaven, I'd be interested to know if there are anybody watching this video who hasn't played tabletop, you've just gone straight into digital. That would be interesting to know, because I think that stuff like this, it kind of goes on behind the scenes and perhaps you weren't aware of exactly how the game works. So hopefully this has helped to maybe add a little bit of context to what's going on in your game. As always, guys, if you did enjoy the video, please do toss it a like. It helps me so much on pushing my videos out there to more Gloomhaven players, so I really appreciate it. And if you enjoy the content, then consider checking out some of my other videos. I've got class guides, I've got other videos about Gloomhaven Digital in my channel description below, but also consider subscribing if you like to keep up with all of the content that I'm doing. I've got plenty of plans for more Gloomhaven content coming soon. So that's all I have for you today, guys. Thank you again so much for watching. Have a great week. I'll catch you soon. Bye. With the wasabi, see what happens. No soy sauce dipping. Whoa. Oh fuck, I'm a fuck. Well, that's not one. I can't eat that. No, that's really bad. No.